During this class, we are going to restrict some specific actions over the transaction resource. In fact, we are going to restrict the endpoint to obtain the specific data about a specific transaction and the endpoint to obtain the seller of a specific transaction. Now, these have a special condition. We are going to provide access to the seller of the product of that transaction or to the buyer of that transaction. Additionally, we are going to provide access to the seller of the transaction for the buyer and, of course, to the seller. The seller can obtain its own details again, and additionally, the buyer can obtain the details of the seller of the product purchase. So, again, we need to create a policy. We are going to call this transaction policy using the transaction model. Once it is created, we just need to go to the code. And there we are going to use only the view method because we are going to restrict only the possibility to obtain. The condition here is going to be that the user is or the seller or the buyer. If the user ID is equals to the buyer of the transaction, or the user ID is equals to the seller of the product of the transaction. So we need to go to the product, then to the seller of that product, and finally obtain the ID. So if one of those conditions is true, well, we can provide access to that specific action. Now, let's do register. Remember to import the definitions. And now we need to protect two different actions in two different controllers. So let's go to the transaction controllers. And we need to start with transaction controller. On transaction controller, we are going to restrict only the show method. The index method is going to be restricted only for admin users, and we are going to do that later. Oh, I just checked here a little typo, so let's fix this easily, and let's proceed. So we are going to use the can middleware to view, sending the instance of transaction that we are receiving from the root only for the show method. That is very good. Then we need to restrict the transaction seller controller that only has the index method. So let's copy this from here. And again, only can view the transaction instance, but this time is only for the index method. So if you are wondering about why we are not restricting the transaction category controller, it is because it is publicly accessible. Basically, all that we are only protected with the client credentials middleware is publicly accessible. Let's check that. For that, we need to use a new user because I removed the user on the previous class when we test the delete action. So this time I'm using an access token, a personal access token for the user with ID 1x7. It's to obtain the list of transactions of this user. So you can see, for example, the transaction 159 is a transaction for this seller. And if we check as buyer, these have some other transactions that, for example, is the ID 70. So let's try to obtain the sellers of the transaction 70. And we can do that. But if we use a different ID, the action is not going to be authorized. Similarly, if we try to obtain only the details about the transaction with ID 70, it is allowed because we are, at this moment, the buyer of that specific transaction. Now, we are the seller of other transaction, the transaction 159. So, if we try to obtain this, we have access, and it's not completely required, but we can do that. We can obtain the details about our own self. As you can see here, we are acting as buyer and sellers, and we can have access to the details of the transaction being both the buyer or the seller. We are done here and we can proceed in the next class. See you there.